Yes, hello once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. We're just about ready to head out on our next outdoor excursion of 2024, which will be the Scottish Classic Round 1 event at Straven this weekend. So look out for all of the bikes from the paddock and of course all of the races from that event coming up very soon. But we're going to fill in that time before that event by taking a look at another German classic. Now this particular bike here is quite a rare machine due to the fact that this could possibly be one of the last of this particular makes of machines from the 1980s. So let's jump straight into that video now and take a look at this quite nice looking 1982 EX410 German Kramer. Now, we've already featured a few Kramer dirt bikes here on my channel in the past, and certainly a few of them have been quite unique examples, and this featured 1982 EX410 is yet another super rare bike, because these 82 Monoshock bikes were reputed to be some of the very last of the Kramer off-roaders, which makes them a very rare commodity when it comes to these German-built motocrossers. But just in case you're even the slightest bit interested in the Kramer history, here's a quick resume of their past. Now, Fritz Kramer originally ran a small motorcycle business that was established by his father some years before in Laubas-Esbach in the state of Hesse in Germany. And Fritz was certainly very active in the world of motocross and enduro racing, where at that time he raced and he sold DKW motorcycles. And it was sometime later when he began building his own off-road bikes that he then took up with that other German bike manufacturer, Maiko. And during that particular partnership, his bikes would then be called Kramer Maikos, of which it's said that only around 50 to 80 of those bikes were actually made between 1975 and 1976. Now, it was around 1977 when Kramer began building these kind of scrambles bikes with the Kramer chassis and the Austrian-powered two-stroke Rotax engines, which of course proved very successful with most of those bikes being sold in France, because they did have a very enthusiastic importer that actually raced and promoted the Kramer machines to the rest of Europe. Now, sometime later, Kramer then kind of fell into financial difficulties in the early 1980s, and they eventually closed due, it's said, to be owed money from that aforementioned French importer. And it was around 1982 when a brand new company was then formed in Italy, which they then renamed these bikes as Kramer ITs, or Kramer Italy, which is why you sometimes see these Kramers with Kramet logos on the side of the tank. But by this time, the old German-based company was now totally Italian-owned, but Rotax still continued to supply the engines for the Italian Kramers. Now, sometime later, it was a man called Peter Hauser, who was an importer and distributor of all kinds of motorcycles, and he bought what was left of the German part of Kramer, and he did his very best to try and resurrect the remnants of what was left of the original Kramer company. But his enthusiasm and dedication for the once great manufacturer just happened to be not enough to save the name or himself, because while Peter was heading towards complete financial ruin, he sadly then committed suicide. But without question, these Kramers were fantastic bikes, even considering their relatively short lifespan, because they did have a very strong, lightweight steel chassis. They handled superbly, and being powered by that Austrian-made Rotax two-stroke power plant, they also had an engine that was both powerful and virtually unbreakable. And in fact, I'm quite a personal friend of Keith Ree, who was a works rider for Kramer back in the day, and he told me that he still recalls the very first day that he threw his leg over a Kramer at a track test day, and he immediately fell in love with the way that the bike handled and the power delivery from that Rotax engine. And Keith was so quick on that bike the first time out that he was basically offered a works rider contract on the spot. And in these couple of pictures here, you can see Keith Ree's original works bike, which is a 1981 410 model, which at that time had a pair of twin shocks at the rear of the bike that were tucked up underneath that seat. Although when you do look at these 81 bikes at first glance, you'd almost swear that these were a monoshocker. But there's already a video detailing this Keith Ree Kramer works bike here on my channel, so you might want to take a look at that sometime when you have a bit of spare time. Anyhow, getting back here to our featured bike, which was another one that I came across at the Kendal Revival Scramble this year, and the bike's owner, whose name unfortunately escapes me at this time, had just recently bought this bike, mainly because he said that he likes bikes that are a little bit different and unusual, and not like the run-of-the-mill Micos and Hondas that you normally see on a daily basis. Now, at the time I took these pictures, the owner wasn't exactly sure himself as to the bike's year of manufacture or even its background, and I must admit, even I at first glance thought that it was a modified 1981 bike that had possibly been converted to a single rear shock. But after a bit of digging and sending a few pictures of this bike to my old pal Keith Ree, we are now both convinced that this is a 1982 EX410 with the PDS rear suspension system, or progressive damping system if you want to give it its full title. And it also turns out that our 82 bike could possibly be one of the last 82 Kramers made before the factory ceased trading. Now, once again, and as with most of these old Kramers from the early 1980s, this one here is powered by this compact and very reliable Austrian-made Rotax two-stroke engine, and this one here is one of the bigger 410cc power plants. And the build and design of this two-stroke engine made it ideal as an off-road motorcycle power plant, because it was relatively small, it was compact, and it produced a decent amount of power. And these engines did come in a variety of power sizes, from around 125 right up to these big Bruiser 410s. But these Rotax motors were sold around the world, and they were supplied to a multitude of different bike manufacturers, including the likes of Can-Am and SWM, Cotton, and even ATK in America, to name just a few. But the engineering and the build quality on these motors was absolutely first class, which is why they were so popular with riders and manufacturers alike. But as we continue to make our way along this 1982 Kramer, it certainly looks like the genuine article, because it still appears to have its original exhaust expansion chamber from that year, which, as you can see, is virtually ding or dent free even after 42 years on the racetrack. But as we track along here to the motor's tailpipe at the back, now even this item is the self-same part that the German factory bolted on to this Kramer in 1982. And also here at the back of the bike, as you can see, it was a quite straightforward box section type steel swing arm on these 1982 410s, but this swing arm was still strong, and again it was an upgrade on the earlier 1981 swing arm that you can see here on the Keith Ree Works Racer, where it was more of a kind of lighter oval shaped tube type swing arm that had that pair of twin shocks that ran across the back. Which of course brings us onto our Kramer's PDS, or progressive damping system, that I mentioned earlier, and this cage type linkage then led on to a single central monoshock unit that ran underneath the bike seat. Although I have to say that when I first saw this linkage, it was certainly something that I'd never come across before on one of these Kramers, which is why I then had to call in the experts again, who enlightened me that this was indeed a purebred Kramer suspension system that was actually made specifically for these 82 bikes, so that the swing arm and the linkage could then accept one single monoshock rather than the two that you'd normally find on the earlier 81 bikes. But in this picture here you can see how it all bolts together with that single monoshock there in the middle, as opposed to what would have been two smaller shocks side by side on the earlier bikes that would have been bolted directly onto the rear swing arm in the usual arrangement. And basically this was really just Kramer trying to keep pace with the rest of the off-roaders during the early 1980s, who were already starting to shy away from the old twin shock rear suspensions in favour of these much more modern single monoshock affairs. And exactly how good this Kramer PDS system was like, I don't actually know, but then again, we had Suzuki with their full floater, Honda had their ProLink suspension, Kawasaki had their Unitrack, and of course Yamaha had their monocross suspension. So I suppose Kramer had to follow suit and come up with a design and a name to fit onto their new 1982 machine. So I expect that's why they ended up calling it their PDS suspension system. So as we move on to the front of our German Kramer, it's those ever popular Italian Marzocchi forks, which just like that Rotax engine were also fitted to many different makes and models of off-road and even road bikes in the 1970s and early 80s. And these forks never had much in the way of adjustments or tuning to their rebound and damping settings, but you could certainly still make some changes by adding or removing air through the Schrader valves that were fitted on the top of each fork leg. Now these fork socks that have been added to the inner stanchions are of course not standard items, but somebody's certainly put these on naturally just to try and help keep dust and dirt and other kind of track debris from sticking to those smooth surfaces of the chrome inserts of the stanchions, and possibly, of course, damaging those precious oil seal lips, which subsequently then, of course, lead to the forks leaking oil. Although overall it has to be said that these Marzokkis were still decent forks when you consider the period of the time when there really wasn't much in the way of choice anyhow for your off-road suspensions. So as basic as these were, they still did a decent job. But also for the early 1980s, it was still the old school shoe and drum brakes here on the front and at the rear of these German Kramers, which again were decent little stoppers, because these old Kramers weren't exactly heavy bikes, and they were easy enough to throw around the track, which is another point that our works rider Key 3 pointed out to me when he tried one of these bikes for the very first time. And also here at the back of the bike, it was another drum brake with a relatively small sized rear sprocket, just to get that gearing absolutely spot on to suit the 410 Rotax engine. But I'm pretty sure that both the front and the rear wheels on this 82 Kramer have been swapped at one time for these nicer gold anodized alloy rims, which I suppose isn't too surprising that they've been changed considering this bike's age. But there was one little thing that I did forget to mention with regards the bike's rear suspension. Now, the single monoshock that's fitted to our PDS suspension system is a top-of-the-range Swedish Öhlins unit, which of course has its remote gas and oil reservoir bolted onto this front part of the bike's frame, so as that the on-rushing air will help to keep the oil and gas inside this canister a little bit cooler when that rear shock gets worked hard on those bumpy tracks. And so as we move on to the Kramer's fuel tank, which naturally is made of plastic, as were most other off-road dirt bike tanks of the 1990s, and usually this Kramer fuel cell here held more than enough premix gas to keep our Rotax 410 motor buzzing along on even the longest of race motos. And if you look close enough at this tank, you can see that these plastic fuel cells on these Kramers were slightly translucent as well, so you could physically see exactly how much gas was inside the tank by a quick glance here on the side. So it was a slightly more accurate indication than just removing the cap and then sloshing the bike from side to side. But as I remember, there was a downside to these plastic fuel tanks, which was that it was always difficult to try and keep graphics stuck on the side. Now, whether that was due to petrol spillages while you were filling the tank up, or maybe some other unknown factor, but I can always remember that it was a bit of a pain when I was trying to keep graphics stuck on the plastic tank of my old 1980 440 Myco. But certainly this racing seat here on the Kramers, as I remember, was one of the plus points on these German bikes, because these seats had just about the right amount of firmness and padding to make it quite a good place to put your backside down on while you were making your way around the track. But again, to access the engine's foam air filter, which was underneath, it was only really a couple of small bolts at the back that secured it to that light steel tubed frame. So it was easy off and easy on in terms of maintenance or other servicing items. Now, all of the plastics that are fitted onto our 410 are still the original and stock parts that came with the bike in 1982. So again, these bits and pieces have all survived intact for more than 42 years, because these days these are rare parts and they're almost unobtainable. So these all add to the authenticity and the originality of this quite rare machine. And up here in the pilot seat, it's a relatively modern pair of rental handlebars, and I'm also sure that both the clutch and that front brake lever are proper Magura items, which also have the rubber lever pivot covers intact as well. Now, our 42-year-old Kramer racer may not be 100% original, but then again, not many 42-year-old motocrossers are in these modern times, because as the years roll by, it's certainly becoming increasingly difficult to try and find parts for these older bikes, especially if you want to keep it racing on the track. But if you're looking to build or keep an old school show bike, then naturally you wouldn't have to continually search the world for parts for these bikes every single week. Although, as I said, the owner had only recently bought this bike, and at the time he wasn't exactly sure what he'd actually bought, but after a little bit of researching and phone calls to people in the know, we can now definitely confirm that the owner of this machine's just bought himself a very good and almost original example of a 1982 German Kramer with a 410 Rotax motor, and of course that rear PDS suspension system with that single monoshock at the back. And as I said, a quite rare bike, because you never ever see these old Kramers still racing, and these 1982s were basically the last of the once great Kramer legacy before they then disappeared into oblivion. So these two factors alone make this a unique and very interesting piece of off-road memorabilia. So there you have it again. As I said, a quite rare 1982 German Kramer, an EX410 model, one of the very rare monoshock bikes that came from the Kramer factory in the early 1980s. Right, so as I said, coming up next we'll be heading off to cover the Scottish Classic Round 1 event at Straven this coming weekend, and this has been their very first race event of 2024, because the two events that they had scheduled for April and May were both cancelled due to circumstances beyond the club's control. So we're looking forward to getting the Scottish Classic Club up and running for this year. So look out for all of the bikes from the paddock, and of course all of the racing from that event, which will be posted here on my channel soon after. But once again, thanks very much for your support of my YouTube channel, and I hope you will return very soon to see more of these old school classics when you tune in to Classic Dirt Bike TV.